Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video on the Questioning Christianity channel, which seeks to answer the question of whether or not there will be free will in heaven. This is a question that I have often asked. Usually the explanation for why God allows evil on earth is free will, but if free will necessarily results in evil, then there won't be free will in heaven. So if the end result is a lack of free will, then what was even the point? I have yet to see an apologist take on this question, so I was happy to see that this video exists, so let's take a look.
If you are familiar with the problem of evil, or how could a good God let bad things happen, then a common response from Christian thinkers, drawing from the resources of the Christian story, has been to invoke the concept of free will.
Yes, they turn to free will, a concept that cannot be found in the Bible, and was introduced to Christianity through the writings of Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century CE, with Origen seeming to have grabbed the idea from Platonist and Stoic philosophers that came before him.
The argument goes that because God wanted human beings to experience deep and meaningful relationships, love, and to have a meaningful role where what we do shapes our reality, that God had to imbue humanity with significant moral freedom.
Well, here's the thing with that. Y'all keep trying to say that God is omnipotent, which would suggest that God has the power to do whatever he wants to do, which would include creating a universe in which free will exists without evil. To rescue this, apologists have to walk back the omnipotent claim, saying that God can only do that which is logically possible. But then that places the laws of logic above God. God has no choice but to obey the higher power that is found in the laws of logic. So you're left with a choice between God being subject to a higher power, or God choosing to make the laws of logic whatever he wanted them to be, thus making any logical contradiction between the existence of free will and the non-existence of evil entirely his fault.
Which entails the possibility that we could abuse our freedom, reject God and his good design, and so choose to do evil.
Yes, and if that is the implication of free will on Earth, why would it be any different in heaven? And if it is different in such a way that free will is preserved, but somehow we no longer freely choose to do evil, then why could God not have made it that way in the first place? The argument usually is something along the lines of character development. We have to grow into the kinds of people who would freely choose not to do evil. But this is an all-powerful God we're talking about. He could have made us with fully developed character in the first place. That's not even a logical contradiction, that's just a matter of design choice.
But then the question becomes, well, what about the afterlife? For surely, when it comes to the new heavens and the new earth, God will still want us human beings to have loving relationships and a meaningful role, right? So what does that mean then for free will?
It means that it cannot exist, given that you have laid out the existence of evil as one of the necessary results of the existence of the free will that makes such things possible.
And if it's possible for us not to sin in heaven, then why didn't God just create things that way in the first place, and avoid the whole dark story that gives rise to the problem of evil?
Exactly. If heaven is a realm that both has free will, but also has no sin or suffering or evil, then that means that such a realm is possible. If such a realm is possible, then God could have created such a realm first, without going through the shithole realm that he did create.
Now, in short, I do think we'll have free will in heaven. The Christian story doesn't give us any reason to think that our meaningful agency and freedom of choice will be taken away in the new creation.
I mean, the Christian story doesn't really contain anything to suggest that such things were even given to you in the first place, so yeah, there's no reason to say that they get taken away, really. Can't take away what wasn't there, after all.
First, there is an asymmetry between Eden and eternity in the vast difference between moral innocence and moral maturity.
Yeah, there's that development thing. Not sure why God couldn't have made people already fully morally mature. After all, one of the young Earth creationist explanations for why the Earth looks like it's billions of years old is that God created an already mature creation. I can't say for certain whether this guy is a young Earth creationist. He does that thing that apologists like to do where they try and both sides it without giving away their own position in order to not alienate part of their audience. But he acknowledges that mature creation is a possibility for God in another video.
They argue that God created our universe mature, with the necessary cosmic backstory to balance the physics and chemistry required for life here on Earth.
So, given that God could have created the universe already mature, I see no reason why he could not have done the same for humans. In fact, Adam and Eve were already adults when God created them, were they not? They didn't go through the maturation process, they were already mature. Of course, you could and probably would argue that they weren't morally mature, they were only physically mature, because if they were morally mature, then they wouldn't have eaten the fruit. But then this leaves us wondering why God is capable of making a thing that is mature in one sense, but incapable of doing the same for a different type of maturity.
Let's say I came to you on the afternoon of my wedding day and I confidently proclaimed, I am innocent of adultery. Now, you might look at me and think, well, Dan, it's only been a few hours, so you don't exactly get a medal for that.
Actually, I'd be thinking that it was a guilt-ridden accidental admission, because that's not the kind of thing that most people say on their wedding day.
I mean, Aaron looks amazing, you barely had any opportunity, so even though you are morally innocent, I'm just not that proud of you.
Just want to say how gross it is that the first thing you put out there as a reason that you hadn't cheated yet was that your wife looks amazing. Not how horrible it would be for you to betray the person who's supposed to be your life partner on the day of the formalization of that partnership. Not that, just, but she's still hot though.
But let's say I came back to you after 50 years and say it again. I am innocent of adultery. For over 50 years, I've never betrayed my vows to Aaron, not even in my imagination.
Then that's the base level of expectation as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the betray in your mind bit is weird. My partner and I both know that looking at attractive people is pleasant, and we have had conversations about what would count as a betrayal, so ultimately it is up to the individual couples, but yeah, I will never betray my partner in a way that she would actually see as a betrayal, and you don't get a medal for that at year 50 any more than you should on day 1.
All of a sudden, those words carry a different weight.
I don't really think that they do. Like, yeah, we'd likely all have a more visceral reaction to the idea of a guy cheating on his wife on their wedding day when compared to cheating after 50 years, but it's not like cheating on someone is an accident that has more chance of occurring as time goes on. There are several steps in the process that take a high level of intentionality. Well, I guess this is where your not even in my imagination thing comes in, because it's easy to accidentally think of things, so that would be slightly more impressive, but anyone reasonable will recognize that there is a significant difference between imagining doing something and following through on that imagined thing in reality. This is why conversations are important. I can't say that I've never imagined a scenario that, were it to play out in reality, my partner would consider it to be a betrayal. However, if I were to approach her and be very solemn and serious about it, and confess my guilt about betraying her in my imagination, she'd likely burst out laughing.
I have a confession. I cheated on you in my imagination.
Okay.
My fidelity is morally commendable. Why? Well, not just because of the change in my moral innocence. Nothing's changed on that score. Rather, what has been added to this innocence is the development of moral maturity.
Not really. It's more like the continuation of moral maturity. If you develop moral maturity, then that means that you were not at one point morally mature, which means you would not have had the moral fortitude to resist the temptation of cheating. So in this case, if you didn't cheat but were morally immature, then all that means is that there was a lack of opportunity. In order to maintain the innocent streak in a way that is actually commendable, you would have had to start out with the moral maturity required to say no even when temptation is right there staring you in the face. Your analogy here is clearly headed towards Adam and Eve and what went down in Eden, so let's just spell it out. Adam and Eve cheated on the first day because they lacked the moral maturity, which implies that, had they gone longer without having eaten the fruit, they would have developed enough moral maturity to resist the temptation. If we turn this back into your analogy, this means that the way to develop moral maturity is to cheat on your spouse on the wedding night, and then to learn how to not do that as time goes on. Which would then mean, we've been married for 50 years and I haven't had an affair in 25, would be way more impressive than your simple, I've just never cheated. It's a weird stance, but you do you, I guess.
This is what I think happens to the people in the Christian story when they believe in and follow Jesus. They're not just given a ticket straight to heaven exactly as they are, but rather God changes us. We become a new creation, where God transforms our desires and trains us through discipline so that with the help of the Holy Spirit, we're made to be like Jesus.
Okay, there, right there. You get how that's not free will, right? If changing our desires doesn't count as violating free will, then he could have just designed our desires to be in accordance with his moral standard right from the get-go. Will and desire are literally synonyms. So if the way God stops evil from entering heaven is by changing our desires, then he is directly changing our will, making it not free. And that's not even getting into the darker implications of what you're saying here. If, before someone qualifies for God changing our desires, we need to go through a process of moral development by living life on Earth as a Christian for enough time, as you basically just said, then that means that all the dead babies go to hell. That means that new converts go to hell. That could mean that, even if you've been a devout Christian for years, it wasn't quite long enough for sufficient moral development, so you go to hell. That's fucked up.
We might call this a freed will, where our nature has been recreated and our character forged to only choose between good options, loving what God loves.
How in the ever-loving fuck does that not violate free will in your mind? And why in the ever-loving fuck could God not design us with this so-called freed will in the first place if it doesn't?
And so this notion of moral maturity, where in our resurrected bodies we will be perfected in our love for God and others, it goes a long way to explaining why, even with free will, we won't give in to the temptation the same way that Adam and Eve did, or even that Satan did.
No, it doesn't. It just completely eliminates free will, and then pretends like it hasn't. I've been told that my idea of God only creating the people who will freely choose to do good in the first place would count as a violation of free will because that is God making all the decisions by proxy. Not sure how they square that with God having perfect foreknowledge in the first place and still being the creator, but whatever. Let's just say that I'm wrong, and that would count as a violation of free will. What you are suggesting here is basically the same thing, but with the added bonus of a bunch of people being tormented in hell for no good reason added on top of it.
Who, although created morally innocent, had not yet willingly submitted themselves to become morally mature.
So, as long as you willingly submit yourself to having your free will removed, it doesn't count as violating free will? And that's not even getting into the coercion that is the threat of hell. Submit to letting me remove your free will, or be tortured for all eternity. You see how that's not actually a free choice, right?
Second, there is another asymmetry between Eden and eternity in our relationship with God. If originally God had made himself known to us in all the splendor of his divine attributes, then the sheer intensity of his presence would overwhelm us to such a degree that we wouldn't be able to resist worship.
So, being in God's presence automatically renders free will null and void? Not sure how that's supposed to make free will possible in heaven, where you will be eternally in God's presence. So, yeah, I guess there is no free will in heaven.
God would be irresistible, removing any meaning behind our choice to love him.
To take it back to your marriage analogy, if the reason I don't cheat on my partner is that I find her to be irresistible, does that mean I don't get any credit for not cheating on her?
So perhaps one of the reasons why in the Garden of Eden you see God walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening but then leaving was that heaven were only courting earth at this point in the story.
Okay, this analogy doesn't really work. The courtship process is supposed to be about convincing the other person that you are good enough for them, that they should choose you over their other suitors. As such, during courtship, you generally put your best foot forward. Side note, I'm not endorsing the courtship model of dating here. Personally, I think that if you're looking for a long-term relationship, being real with the person you're dating is best. If you're putting your best foot forward all the time, then they aren't seeing the full picture, and in a long-term relationship, they eventually will. So it's best to put all your cards on the table fairly early on in order to figure out compatibility. And of course, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't work on improving yourself to become more appealing to potential partners, if that's a goal of yours. And honestly, I wouldn't even suggest improving yourself with that specific goal in mind. Just get better to be a better person for yourself, and then that will make you more attractive to potential partners. But then even if it doesn't, you end up with a, oh no, I improved myself and became a better person with a more fulfilling life, for nothing other than just my own personal fulfillment. How horrible.
The door was left open for humanity to make a significant decision.
But without having all the information required to make a fully informed decision. Like, literally, they did not know good and evil until they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and eating from that tree was the evil act that got them kicked out of the garden in the first place. How does that make any sense?
Do we want to be with God for all eternity, or do we not?
And as you have suggested here, God was hiding part of his true nature from them before they made that decision. And that's not even the decision that they made. To reiterate, they didn't know it would be evil to eat from the tree because they didn't have knowledge of evil until after they ate from the tree.
God's absence was the very mechanism that afforded humanity the legitimate opportunity to reject his proposal.
Was that really necessary, though? You brought up Satan earlier in pointing out that Satan himself fell well in heaven, so Satan decided to reject God while in God's full and unfiltered presence.
Such an explanation works even for Lucifer's primal sin, for Scripture describes that most angels are not always in the manifest presence of God.
Okay, sure. Why the fuck not? It's not like Satan's fall is found anywhere other than Dante anyway, so as long as you're just basing your story on his made-up shit, you may as well make up shit of your own to make things make sense in light of free will philosophy. You know, that philosophy that didn't even become official church doctrine until the 5th century? Weird that such an important doctrine didn't show up until well after all the books of the Bible were even written.
And so a sense of God's absence could have provided the space for Satan to either choose divine love or swell with selfish pride.
Yeah, but things get all kinds of fucked up when you think about the whole Satan thing for a few seconds. God knows everything that ever has or ever will happen, so he knew when he made Satan that he would fall. And when Satan fell, instead of banishing him to hell immediately, or to some desolate place like the moon or interstellar space or something like that, God let him set up shop on Earth, fully knowing that he would cause Adam and Eve to sin immediately. Would they have still eaten the fruit if Satan hadn't tempted them into it? Just how much evil on Earth has been blamed on the devil and his angels? Why are they allowed on Earth to cause this evil? Can humanity really be said to have free will if we're constantly being tricked into making bad choices by a super powerful fallen angel? Would preventing Satan from influencing humanity not be a better way to allow us to exercise free will than letting him drag us down? Satan makes no sense.
In the new creation, however, the relational calculus shifts dramatically. For those who have responded to Jesus' invitation in the gospel and have chosen to be with God for all eternity, Scripture describes that God comes to dwell with us, overwhelming us with his presence so that his glory forever replaces the sun.
And given that earlier you described his presence as being so powerful as to overwhelm our free will, this will serve to remove our free will, thus answering the question, will there be free will in heaven, with a resounding no.
Having freely chosen to make eternal vows, using our freedom to determine our future, now the cosmic marriage between heaven and earth begins.
So essentially, there is free will in heaven because we will, by that point, have freely chosen to give up our free will. Call me pedantic if you like, but that doesn't sound like free will in heaven. I mean, if there were an option to regain your free will should you change your mind at some point, then sure, that could potentially still count as a weird sub-dom relationship thing that contains free will. But without the option to regain free will, then once it's surrendered, it is permanently gone, and thus, even though the choice was freely made, you cannot say that free will remains while in heaven. But also the choice wasn't freely made, it was made under duress from the threat of hell.
And just like with human marriage, that free choice trades one dimension of liberty for another.
Now, you see, in a marriage, you are still free to leave at any time should the relationship dynamic change in such a way that one or both of you no longer desire to live in that relationship. That's not what you just described about heaven.
Shifting from a freedom of options in who you might marry to now having a freedom within marriage to experience intimacy with the one you have chosen.
Yeah, but you likely don't actually believe in a full freedom of who to marry, do you? I'd wager that you are of the opinion that marriage only counts if it contains one penis and one vagina. To his credit, it isn't easy to find anti-LGBTQ stuff on his channel, but he did spend an hour interviewing Sam Alberry, who is one of the people that I have extremely mixed feelings about. He's gay, but has chosen to live a life of celibacy, and now writes articles for the most definitely anti-LGBTQ organization, the Gospel Coalition. And at no point in that interview did either of you come out and say that it is okay to be gay. They did say, essentially, that it's okay as long as you never act on it, and there was a good chunk of the interview that was definitely anti-trans, but while the anti-gay stuff wasn't overt, the subtext was definitely there. So yeah, I'm not going to bet that this guy actually believes in a full freedom to marry whomever you choose.
And what's so meaningful about God veiling his glory from us right now, or even coming humbly in Jesus?
See God come humbly in Jesus now at onlyfans.com/Jehovah69.
Is that it gives us the chance to love God not simply for what he is, but for who he is.
So God hiding a part of who he is from us gives us the chance to love him for who he is? Am I the weird one here, or does that just not make any sense whatsoever?
So God has reasons for passing through this chapter of the story first, as perhaps the best of all possible ways to get to the best of all possible world.
Except, according to the Bible, it won't be the best of all possible worlds. At least, not for humans at any rate. Ecclesiastes 4:2-3 makes it quite clear that never being born in the first place is better than living and then dying. And then Jesus makes it quite clear himself that the majority of people to ever live will wind up in hell in Matthew 7:13-14. So maybe it's the best possible world for God, but humans get fucked over big time.
And the third reason why I don't think free will in heaven spells out potential disaster is because of what has changed for us by passing through the Christian story.
Yeah, like I said earlier, it apparently doesn't count as not having free will in heaven if you voluntarily give up your free will upon entry. Made all the more sinister by the threat of hell if you don't agree to give up your free will.
See, Adam and Eve may have been warned in Eden that sin leads to death, but they had no visceral concept of how death tasted.
Which is one of many reasons why Eden was not a fair test for them.
They hadn't seen the tragic fallout of their evil as its consequences destroyed their own family and reverberated down through the ages, but we have.
And even if they had known of it, they literally could not have had any knowledge of good and evil until they ate from the tree, so they wouldn't have been capable of understanding why that was bad. It'd be akin to punishing a newborn baby for crying when it's hungry instead of asking politely. It's not even capable of understanding enough to know that it doesn't need to cry. Crying is literally the only way it knows to express hunger, so punishing that behavior would just be pointless cruelty.
We are intimately aware with the suffering and the grief, and we're awake to the terrible cost of sin.
Okay, but this doesn't answer whether free will exist in heaven. It just means that we are more able to make an informed decision about what should have been done in the Garden of Eden, even if I grant everything that you've said thus far.
And we also have caught a glimpse of the depths of God's love for us in Jesus.
He loved us so much that he raped a teenager so that he could temporarily kill himself. Not sure how that's supposed to be a good thing. He could just forgive us without there being a human sacrifice first. He had that ability according to Isaiah 43:24-25. Hell, according to those verses, the people he's forgiving don't even need to be repentant. He can just choose to forgive. So, if anything, the whole Jesus thing makes him look like he's obsessed with blood and death, rather than being a loving being that we should want to spend time with.
Who is willing to embrace our suffering and pay our debt at Calvary.
He had the option to forgive our debt without payment, but chose instead to only accept a brutal human sacrifice as payment. Again, that does not make God look like the good guy here.
So it seems to me that the serpent's original temptation in Eden, that you can't really take God at his word, that he doesn't really have your best intentions at heart, that he's keeping something good from us, these temptations will now fall on deaf ears.
To be fair, though, the serpent was literally the only character in that story that told the truth. In Genesis 3:1-5, all the serpent did was ask if God really said that you shouldn't eat of any tree in the garden, and when Eve corrected him by pointing out that they could eat from all the trees except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the eating of which would result in their death, the serpent said that they would not die, but when you eat of that tree, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So God told them they'd die if they ate from the tree. The serpent said, no, you won't die, you'll be like God and know good and evil. Then they ate from the tree, and they didn't die. They lived for nearly 1,000 years after that. And when God kicks them out of the garden, he explicitly states that he's doing so because they have become like God in knowing good from evil. So now they must be forbidden access to the tree of life. So God lied by telling them that they'd die the day they ate the fruit. Adam and Eve lied when they said that the serpent lied to them, but the serpent told the truth. What happened was exactly what the serpent said would happen.
Plus, at the end of the story, Satan is finally vanquished, and any evil in the world, it's wiped away.
That still doesn't answer the question of why Satan was allowed on Earth in the first place. The universe is a big place. There's plenty of spots that God could have banished Satan to that would not have resulted in billions of people going to hell because of Satan.
So that means, factoring in our redeemed bodies, the new creation is a world without any source of temptation to lead us away from the love of God.
But do you need a lack of temptation to freely choose God? Like, sorry to keep bringing this back to my personal relationship. I know sometimes I'm a bit mushy for you guys, but I'm not even tempted to cheat on her. So does this mean that I am not free to choose to cheat on her? No, obviously not. It just means I'm not going to.
Now, these are just 3 of the asymmetries between Eden and eternity, but they shed light on why, even with free will in heaven, there is no chance of a new creation fall.
No, they really don't. You just redefined free will to mean not free will.
And perhaps why God had to start with this world in order to bring about what we long for in the next.
Yeah, no, you didn't explain that either. That's it for this one. Holy moly, this is a short one. Remember back when I'd call a video long if it got to 20 minutes? Fun times. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Biker Mage, who says, "Ew, using parsecs instead of light years? Yes, I'm a light yearist. Take that, Parsecolix!" Yeah, well, I use parsecs because they are clearly superior in that they can measure not only distance, but how quickly you can complete the Kessel Run.
It's the ship that made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs.
So there. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Saint Redfield, and all the rest, who are the free will that is given up upon entry to heaven. If you'd like to somehow still count as free will existing despite explicitly being forfeited, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!